Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. I'm your host, Mott Tuman. Thank you for coming today. It's my first solo show, so I'm excited to be here. Today we're going to be talking about how to create your own primary watercolor palette, and I'm going to show you how to use them, how to put them in your pans, and then we're going to do a little demo on how to paint with them and talk about a little bit of color theory. But before we get to that, our teacher's code for tonight is JL283. That is a very important code. If you want to be able to get anything that you see during the show, if you want to be able to find it after the show, go to JerrysArtarama.com and type that code JL283 into the search bar. It'll bring you to the teacher's cart where you'll be able to find all of these materials. And yeah, so we can get started. I just have today our Lucas Aquarelle 1862 watercolors, right? And these three watercolors are specifically their primaries in their line. Now, while Lucas has their own specific primaries, not every brand does. Some brands might not label anything specifically as a primary. So if you're looking to follow along with this using different mediums besides Lucas, you might be wondering, like, how do I figure out which specific colors are my primaries? Because there's going to be a lot of different magentas or reds and blues and cyans and all of that you can go through. And the most important thing you can do to figure out if you got like an accurate primary is to look at your color codes. If we can go to the side camera here, your color codes, at least for the Lucas brand, are going to be listed on your bottle. For Lucas, it's pretty hard to see because they're so small, but it's going to be located right there. For our cyan, we got a PB15:3. And then for our lemon yellow primary, it's going to be a PY3, which is very common for your yellow primaries. Sometimes I've also seen it as like a PY74, which is also a common color for like a yellow primary. And then our magenta, typically it is a PR122 is going to be your code for your primary magenta. Now these can also change slightly between different brands, but generally if they're around these numbers, particularly like your cyan, if you got a PB15 something, you're going to be pretty close to a true cyan primary, and that's how you'll be able to get your good primary colors. Now, I'm going to show you real quick how to fill pans with these. If we go back to the overhead, I already got some pans filled here that you can see. This is what I'm going to be using in our demonstration because these take a long time to dry, but I'm going to show you how to fill some of these. Now, we have several different brands we're using our New York Central empty pans. So we have our half pans of 48, we also have full pans of 48, and depending on what kind of palette you want to use, there's also the magnetic pans, which these are kind of fun if you're making your own palette. You know, they can have a little magnetic base, and I even use them in this palette right here, just because sometimes there's these little clasps that you can use to stick down your tube, but sometimes I have weak fingers and I'm not always able to get that completely closed. So I actually use the magnetic ones for here because they'll stick to this just a little bit, and I worry a little bit less about them like falling out of my palette. So magnetic ones are very handy if you want them, but we're just gonna be doing our little half pan ones today. So a few tips for filling your half pans. Start out in layers. Ideally, you want to get about 3 different layers of paint dried when you're filling these. And that's because when you're working with watercolors, the first fill that you're going to do on these is going to shrink. It's going to dry, it's going to crack. So you're going to want to do several layers because your second layer will start to fill in some of those cracks, and then your third layer is really going to be like the icing on top of the cake. That kind of makes them perfect little cakes of watercolor. If I can get this open, I might need to use a little rag here. Again, with my weak hands. So I got this pretty chunky vein of paint here and my little half pan. Just going to be very careful and squeeze just a little bit of it and try to get it kind of in the corner there. Right. I'm not trying to fill up the whole thing at once. Set that down real quick. And then I'm going to take a toothpick. I also have, you can use a little sewing pin, basically anything that's like super thin. I even used the end of a watercolor brush when I was originally doing these. I recommend you try to get something that's a little bit thinner than this, because this worked, but it wasn't quite as good because you're gonna get little tiny bubbles in your watercolor paint. And it's ideal to have like a small point to be able to get them out. You just want to push a little liquid watercolor into all the corners of your pan and then kind of swirl it around to make sure you get out any kind of air bubbles that are there. And then it's also too helpful to just give it a little, that'll help bring any kind of air bubbles to the surface of your paint so you're not getting any kind of big cracks caused by air bubbles. But yeah, you just layer in your paint just like that. Wait for it to dry. It'll probably take a few hours till like it's touch dry, but most of the time it'll take overnight or longer for it to be completely dry before you can put your next layer in. If you're really impatient, you can probably get away with just like 2 layers of paint, but I really do recommend 3 if you want like a really nice, clean palette. And I can show you, I have like a little example here of what happens if you don't do multiple layers of paint. This is a palette I found laying around. You can see, particularly on like this yellow pan right here, how it's kind of shrunken in away from the edges. That's naturally going to happen whenever you lay down watercolor paints, and with this white one too. In order to get like proper adhesion to these little plastic pans, multiple layers is really helpful, because I even think, yeah, my little white there is going to pop right out. So if I, like, even now, I could probably go over this with another layer of white and it'll help it adhere better to the pan, keep it from sliding out, especially if you're taking this around traveling and stuff like that. And this is my, I didn't mention it, this is the New York Central empty half pan. I believe there are 12 different slots in here for you to put pans in. You can buy these empty and fill it with whatever kind of colors you like, ideally. And whenever you're making your own palette, I think it is a great start to start with your primaries. Just because, well, I mean, you can start with like a large palette with a lot of different colors in it, but like the more colors you add, if you're like me at all, kind of like the more complicated it gets, the harder it gets to choose. So whenever I start it with a new medium, I like to start it with my primaries. I like to learn just how these specific primaries for the specific brand or medium that I'm working in work, because different primaries from different brands are gonna work differently. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to like kind of match down a very specific primary. You know, color is a spectrum, so different brands are gonna have slightly different colors, and actually can affect the way you're mixing your primaries, which we're gonna get into. But for now, these are the watercolor pans that I filled up with 3 different layers, and we're gonna get right into painting here, and I'll explain a little bit of my color theory as I'm painting this beautiful cathedral. I believe it's a cathedral, and I think we got the link to the reference photo that I'm using. They'll link it if you want to follow along. So the first color, I mean, do we have any questions? Nope, sweet, good to go. So first color, I'm kind of looking here, I got my reference photo right here, which you guys can see. Something very important when you're trying to mix colors, especially when you're just thinking about primaries, is temperature. And temperature can get very complex. So lots of people, especially when they're working with primary watercolor palettes, they'll have 3 primaries that are a little bit cooler and 3 primaries that are a little bit warmer. And that could mean like, I brought these little toothpicks in here to be able to show you how to do the watercolor pans, and I got them in primaries because I thought it would be fun. But you can see here how like the yellow on this toothpick is a lot warmer than the yellow in my pan right here. And even, I think all of them are a bit warmer than the ones, the blue actually is pretty spot on. Warmer than the colors that I picked out, right? But they can still be classified as primaries. Like there's a lot of, I wouldn't say debate, because the whole red, blue, yellow as like your true primaries is kind of dying out more and being overtaken by, you know, magenta, cyan, yellow, which are your true primaries. But a lot of people will still use red. Like I have my little watercolor circle here, and even it says like, oh, your primaries are like red, blue, yellow instead of cyan and everything. Though cyan, yellow, and magenta are probably going to give you your best hues. But like a warmer magenta is going to be like a red, right? And I'm actually not sure if, I think cyan might be a slightly warmer blue or cooler blue, I'm not sure. But it's been handy for a lot of people to have both of them because how complicated color temperatures get, and I'm actually going to start painting because I'm just standing here talking and that's a little boring. But, so I'm going to mix my first color here. I'm just going to start out, I think, blocking in shadows. So I'm going to go for like this cooler blue tone here, which is still pretty warm blue. So I'm going to start out picking up from my little blue cyan, I should say cyan. I'm generalizing. Putting a little bit of that in there. Then I'm going to pick up from my yellow because I know that it has a lot of the tones from, like, this cathedral itself, I think, is like a really warm kind of yellow tone all around, but since it's in shadow, it's getting a lot of that blue. And I mix those two colors together, and obviously we're going to get a really green tone. And I wouldn't say this is necessarily a green. It's pretty close to one. So I'm going to put in a little bit more blue because I don't want it quite that greenish. And then I'm going to put a little bit of just the tiniest bit of magenta in to see if I can start getting a color closer to that. And really, like, a lot of color mixing when you're working with primaries, it's just different ratios of magenta, cyan, and yellow. And that's even probably more blue than I'd like. So I'm going to mix in a little bit more yellow here. I think that's getting pretty close. So I'm going to take, I'm actually going to grab some more water on my brush because I have a lot more. I didn't mix a lot. Definitely think about how much you're mixing prior to laying it down because I have a lot of surface area here to cover and not a lot of paint. But I'm just going to start laying in my colors really quickly on this. And I think that was a pretty good match with the color. Right? I'm going to make sure I block around my windows here. And I've studied this previously before, but whenever I'm starting a watercolor painting, I really like starting with these large flat brushes. Just because it's nice for blocking in large areas of surface like here. Especially when it's talking about kind of architectural buildings. I like them to look a little geometric. So I like using the flat brushes in order to do that. And I'm just gonna pull. Yes.
If you create a pan of watercolor yourself, how long can you expect that to last? Will it last indefinitely?
Well, it definitely won't last indefinitely because at some point you're gonna run out of your watercolor paints, assuming like you're painting a lot. But I will say I have been watercolor painting for a very long time, and I have not had to do very many refills of my pans. Like, even like this little half pan is gonna last you a very long time. It looks like the tiniest bit of paint, but it goes a really long way. I mean, you can see too, I did not fill these pans to their absolute max. They have almost a little bit of kind of a dip, and that dip is kind of helpful for if you want to be able to reactivate your watercolors quicker. Putting a little bit of a dip there can let the water sit and help them reactivate better. So I didn't even fill this to like the absolute peak, but it's still gonna last me a very long time. So, not indefinitely, but like one of these big tubes, they're gonna last you like years, unless you're like really cranking down on your watercolors.
Short of using them yourself, will they go bad if you leave them in the tube, or will they become unrewettable?
Well, it really depends. So some brands are gonna dry out faster than others, particularly if they have a lot of pigment in them. They're probably gonna dry out faster than other brands, but these will last a very long time. I have seen watercolor tubes that are decades old that still work fine. They can still be put in the pan, they can still be mixed around. I mean, I have some pans of watercolors that I found that were like over a decade old, and they still work great. You know, they were still able to re-wet, they were still able to cake perfectly, so they're gonna last you quite a while. And see, I already ran out of that paint, so I'm gonna have to mix more here. Start out back with my cyan. And getting in a little bit more to people who use two different sets of primaries. When it comes to like I said before, like you're never gonna be able to find a true primary. Like these primaries that Lucas has made as their primaries for their line are excellent. You're gonna get a really large array of colors. But particularly if you're looking for super saturated colors, mixing primaries can become very complicated. Like every single primary, or every color that you have really, but particularly every single primary that you have has some kind of what's called a bias. So like your yellow could be biased more towards like a cooler tone or a warmer tone, and same for like your magenta and your cyan. They can be a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer. And sometimes those differences can be so subtle that you might not even really be able to tell. But they can become really important when you're mixing several colors together. So like if I have, let's say, ooh, that was way too much magenta. A warm blue, right? And a, even like a warm yellow. So that blue is tending towards a purple color and your yellow is tending towards a more orange color. You mix those two together, you're gonna get a muddier green than if you had a blue that was tending towards cooler colors and a yellow that was tending towards cooler colors. And that's just something like, it's a little bit tricky to think about, but you kind of have to think about it when you're thinking about like your primary watercolors. And that's why a lot of people like to do two different sets of primaries, some that are cooler and some that are warmer, so they can think about if they want to get super saturated colors, how they're gonna do that. So I'm just gonna actually focus on mixing my colors here because I have not been doing a great job of painting while talking. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, I think that's pretty good. I'm gonna add a little bit more water this time. I'm just gonna keep layering this on here. And this is my first layer of color, so I'm not too worried about it being absolutely perfect. But I'm just gonna continue it down. And if you wanna get really clean washes, like I'm not doing the best of right now, it's helpful to make sure that whatever line that you're continuing off of stays wet. So like this down here, it's got that rough texture, it's already kind of dried out. It's not gonna be great to continue my wash from, but this side of it will be, because I've kept it kind of like damp. Okay.
This may vary from artist to artist, but in your opinion, how many layers would you typically put on a finished painting of watercolor before you're ready for it to be done?
That really does depend between different artists. And I wouldn't say like I gravitate towards a specific number of layers. Like if you've ever heard of negative watercolor painting, it's a really cool technique where essentially, all watercolor painting is basically like this, but you're painting around your areas that you want to keep white, right? And when you're doing like specifically negative watercolor techniques, you might paint a very light layer of a color, then paint around that color all the details, right, in a slightly darker color, and then keep going with darker colors until you get some really amazing depth with your watercolors. And like that can take a lot of layers, right? You might do like 10 different layers of that to get really incredible depth, and I've done things like that before. But in other like layering like this, you don't want to like muddy down your colors, because in some ways, if you're not doing that with like the same kind of color tones on top of each other, it can muddy down your colors really quickly. And so it really does depend. I don't have a specific number that I go for, but maybe it'll be something that I'll be conscious of in the future, and I'll be thinking about to see like, oh, are my colors getting muddier depending on what different kind of layers I'm doing? Like I have this blue right now, so I'm gonna layer a little bit of this yellow color over top of this blue, but I'm not gonna do it a whole lot because I know it's gonna turn super green, and I've already got that blue to a point where I already really like it. So I might not layer as many layers over this blue color that I already have. But it really does depend. So I'm trying to mix this brighter yellow color, right? And I'm sorry I'm painting so slowly here. And it's a warm, bright color, but it's not like a true yellow, right? That true yellow is like way too vibrant for it. Now, and something I didn't mention, I have a white and a black in my palette right here. And the reason for that is because you can mix a black with your primaries, but it is kind of difficult to, especially with watercolors, just because of their transparency. I'm really not doing well tonight. So if you use black pretty often, you might just want to have your own black on the side there that you can use and draw from. Now, when it comes to white, if you have a white watercolor, it's not technically a watercolor, it's technically a gouache. Just because in order to get the opacity for it to be white, it needs to, be super opaque. And it gets to the point where it's kind of like more of a gouache than a watercolor. So if you're ever doing like watercolor competitions and things like that, definitely check the rules, because you might not be able to use that. But I put it in this palette because I do a lot of mixing between gouache and watercolors. I really love mixing gouache and watercolors. And it kind of creates a slightly different effect than if you were to just water down your tones like I'm doing now. I like to think it makes kind of a creamier color, and obviously it makes a much more opaque color, which can be handy. So keep that in mind if you're getting really into watercolors, like if you're using a white. And I'm trying to mix a little bit of this more yellow tone in here so we kind of get the light flashing down on it. But I have all of these shades down here, which are darker and warmer than my yellows up here. So I'm gonna start trying to lay in that color. And I really need to get a lot more water down on this palette than I've been doing because I'm going through these mixes so quickly. And it's taking me a long time to mix them. So I'm gonna add a little bit of red in there, right? And then I'm gonna add a little bit of blue because I still want it to be like slightly cooler. And actually that's fairly close to what I want. Let's see, it might be a little bit darker. I'm gonna add like the slightest bit more magenta and cyan to that. This is mixing with Mott. It's like the littlest bit of color can really drastically change what you're mixing, right? Because this is completely different than what I did before because I added slightly too much of that. And that's also something to think about when you're mixing, is that these primaries, while they're like true primaries, they all have slightly different values. So like your yellow is going to have a really, really light value. It's not going to be as impactful as your cyan or your magenta. And so the littlest bit of cyan or magenta can drastically overpower it. But see, I added a little bit of magenta back into that, and we're back to the color that I really want. So I'm going to be adding this into this lovely building here.
Elizabeth on Facebook is wondering, she said she's read that you should use distilled water to prevent moldy paint. Do you have an opinion on that?
I've definitely heard that before, and you definitely can. Like when you're mixing your paints. I mean, what are you putting water into? Because when you're mixing, like your water is right here, your paint is not going to be molding on the paper, right? If you're leaving your paints mixed with water for a very long time, I definitely can see how that can cause mold, but that's not generally something that I worry about. So I've heard people do that before, but I think it's more of like a slightly purist mentality, is if you want to get really, really clean, saturated colors, maybe that's something you want to go for. But it's not something you necessarily need to do if you're just a hobbyist, you're doing it for fun. So I'm just trying to add in a little more shadows into my painting here. Thank you guys again for being here for my first solo show. I know it's a little bit awkward as I get warmed up to all this, but I promise you, I'm only gonna keep getting better. And I'm really glad we're doing watercolors for this because I love watercolors. And most of the time when I'm working with colors, I'm almost always just using primaries, particularly when I'm working with like acrylics or oils. Just because I haven't been able to find yet a palette that I like really enjoy for them, right? Or that I'm using over and over again, because I tend to do more realism. So I tend to stick to like my primaries because I'm like, well, I'll be able to mix any color. You know, I don't need to worry about going out and buying all these specific colors to use. I'm going to take a little bit of this warm color. I'm going to add it in for a little bit of spots on this side of the building where that sun's really coming down and hit, or I have these really beautiful gold tones right around my edges that I'm going to use this warmer color for because the light's really hitting them, making them really kind of a rich warm tone. And you can see here I put that really rich warm tone on top of this blue, and it's not as vibrant as it is on top of here, right? And that's actually really hard to see because I realize it's very far away for you guys. But like, that's something to be conscious of when you're layering these colors. You're going to be visually mixing every single thing that you lay down. So like over top of white, these are going to look very vibrant. But if I had thought earlier, oh, I'm going to want that to be a super vibrant color, I probably would have had painted around it with my blue. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm just going to do a little dab of it right here, just to accentuate that side of it. And a little bit down here too, where we kind of have these bricks right there. that I'm just hinting at. I'm not trying to go crazy on the details for this one. Okay. And especially for this painting, like your warm and cool tones are very important to think about because we have such a strong directional light coming down. So I'm going to try to, these two are obviously slightly different blues. I'm going to try to even that out and go kind of a layer of maybe a darker tone over top of all of them so that we can get those really crisp shadows. So I'm going to start, of course, with my cyan base. I'm not going to really worry about that color. If you do this a lot like I do, where you mix colors on top of each other in your pan, you do have to worry about muddying your colors up. Since it was only a little bit, and I think I'm already going to be mixing more yellow and magenta into it, I'm not as worried about it. But it's something to be conscious of whenever you're mixing colors, is that the more pigments you add in, the more desaturated your color's going to get. So like right now I'm only working with primaries. I don't have to worry about it as much because the max I'm going to have is 3 different pigments. But if I was working with like a whole set of 48 colors and I was mixing them on top of each other in the same palette, I'm going to muddy my colors up. So that's just something to think about. So it's a greenish tone, a little bit of magenta in. And see, all 3 of those colors together are creating a much darker tone because they're kind of canceling out each other's wavelengths. I mean, I could eventually get black if I continue to add colors like that. But they're slowly kind of desaturating each other and darkening each other as more and more pigments and wavelengths are added together. Actually, I really like that color. I'm going to try to add a little bit more to it.
Mott, when it comes to your reference photo, do you find advantages or disadvantages to having a printed versus a digital version of the photo?
Yeah, I actually do. Because if you guys had seen, like this was what we're using in the thumbnail. This was my original painting done of this photo. You can see this is a lot brighter and more saturated than my reference photo is right here. Because when I printed this out, like printers aren't perfect, right? It's gonna change the colors of whatever you print. You can like, there's ways to perfectly color match whatever you're printing to your computer, but it's quite difficult and it's a lot to do when you're just printing off a reference photo for fun. But printing off is definitely gonna change the saturation of your colors, how dark they are. This is darker than my original one. And so if you wanna just look at your computer screen, I highly recommend doing it for following a reference photo, because lots of times your colors are gonna be crisper, they're gonna be brighter, and you might even be able to get more detail in than your printer would be able to take. I obviously brought it out here so you guys could see the comparison between the two while I'm painting. But yeah, I definitely recommend trying to look at them at a digital device if you can. That's a great question.
Just doesn't play well with our cameras.
Yeah, no, it does not. It would be a really bright, shining iPad right here. You guys wouldn't be able to see it very well. Okay, a little bit more yellow in. And I think I'm pretty happy with that color. And I'm gonna add some more water into my mixing here so it'll go a little bit farther. So let's see if I can cover this whole thing really quickly. And I didn't mention here, but I am using our Mimic Kolinsky Creative Mark Artist brushes. This is the 12 flat that I'm using. And I have several other Mimic Kolinsky brushes on the side here. I've been mainly sticking to this one right now. Just because the flat brushes are really fun for architectural drawings.
If you could only use one flat one, what size would you pick?
What size would I pick? If I can only, does this like, I can only use this brush? Or I guess...
Forever.
Forever. One brush forever. Okay. I'd probably go for like a larger one. Because like these large flat brushes are just, I mainly use them for blocking in large areas of color. So I'm gonna need like a larger brush to do that. Besides that fact, like the edges of your flat brushes can be great for details, no matter how big they are. Even if you get those really, really big, those really, really large brushes like your Mottler brushes, even those can be used for kind of great detail work if you really just get the very corner bit of your brush in. So I'd probably go for like a size 12 like this one. I'm gonna throw in like a really vibrant blue there, kind of for fun. And then maybe, it really is just me mixing 3 colors together. And
So
see.
if you wanted to have an outline,
Yes.
say you wanted to use the accurate waterproof pen or any kind of the waterproof pens, Would you say that it would be best to ink it before you paint or after you paint?
So I would honestly probably say after, which I know a lot of people like to do their inking beforehand, and I guess it also depends on how confident you are with your inking. But it's important to keep in mind that even though watercolors are very transparent, there's still some level of opacity. They're gonna, if you want really crisp, dark lines, they're gonna cover up that darkness just a little bit. They're gonna tone it just a little bit with their color. And so I like to do pen work after I paint because I know those dark lines are really gonna shine through. They're not gonna get covered up by any of my painting. But if you're like less sure about like your line work, probably do it beforehand so you can like get your line work down and be done with it and be over with it, and then you can feel better about the rest of the painting process because you know that the hardest part is over. So it really depends. I personally like to do it after, but to each their own. I'm soaking up water from this brush. Like, these Mimic Kolinsky brushes are really nice. They soak up a lot of water, but it also means that I'm going through a lot of my mixes very quickly. This is one thing too, if you want to keep like a spray bottle nearby, that's what I like to do when I'm doing large watercolor paintings, and just squirt it into the pan so you can get a lot of water really quickly instead of like dipping and bringing it over and dipping and bringing it over. It's very handy. So I still need like a darker color for my shadows. I haven't gotten quite as dark as I like. So I'm gonna mix a lot of my primaries together and try to get almost a black. Not really a black. Maybe I'll add a little bit of my black in there, but the thing is, like, whenever you add a black or a white to your colors, you gotta think about the fact that you're gonna be desaturating whatever your mix is. And that's true of like any color that I mix. I mean, you can see right here, I have a very dark desaturated color just from these primaries, but like that black is gonna really desaturate it a lot. If you can try, if you're looking for a desaturated color and you can use the opposite color on your color wheel, I have my color wheel right here, right? So like if you're trying to get a desaturated orange and you can just use the tiniest bit of blue to desaturate that orange, that's gonna be better than trying to mix black into it, because at the end of the day, you're still gonna have a more saturated, more pure color than if you just mix in a straight black. So I got my dark shadow right here.
So you said that you personally like to mix gouache and watercolor. Do you have any like pet tricks that help with that?
So well, for one, do your watercolor before you layer your gouache. I definitely recommend layering gouache on top of watercolor. When you do it the other way, it's a very fast way to get very muddy colors. But in general, gouache and watercolor pair very well together. I've seen people even like they wanted different tones of gouache. So they mixed in, like they were pouring pans like this and they had a white gouache, that's all they could afford. And so they just mixed a little bit of their pigmented watercolors with their white gouache and were able to get a whole set of like, you know, desaturated gouaches, but still excellent gouaches that they could use for their paintings. They pair just extremely well together. If you're using like going on with watercolor and then putting gouache on top would probably be the best, just because the gouache is the more opaque one too. So you can wait for gouache to dry and layer your watercolors on top of it. It's not gonna have, like the watercolor isn't gonna be able to absorb as much because you essentially have a barrier between it and the paper. But you can kind of like tint the gouache in that kind of way, which is something I've done before. It's not like the best, but it works if you really try to force it. But yeah.
So you were speaking again of filling the pans. And earlier we had a question from Tracy that she was wondering if there's an issue if you use different brands of the same color when you're filling a pan, or I guess maybe refilling a pan.
See, I wouldn't call it necessarily an issue. If you look and see and they have the same exact pigment codes of whatever is present on your tube, you should be fine. You should be good to go. Definitely check your pigment codes before you do that, because even if they have the same exact color name, they're different brands, they can have different pigment codes, they can be different colors. But other than that, you shouldn't have any kind of issue with it if you're checking your pigment codes prior to adding more paint in. So I'm still trying to darken this thing because, you know, us watercolorists like to work in layers and very slowly apparently. So I'm just darkening this like shadowy area one step at a time. I really am excited to go in and darken like right under here, these right in front of these windows, because the contrast between those windows right there is just excellent. And I love my contrast so much. I'm a sucker for really high contrast paintings and things like that. So I'll make sure to add that in for you guys. But see, even with like just those 3 primaries, we're getting a pretty diverse image already of like different colors and things. And let's see. I gotta wait for that to dry a little bit before I can go in and darken those. So I'm gonna try and add a little bit more to this side. And I have some warmer, I think I could maybe darken this up a little bit because it's maybe too light for what I want. I almost want it to be even warmer than what it is. And I gotta be careful when I'm going up against this other wash to not kind of have them absorb into each other because it's still wet. But I'm gonna mix a color to try and go on top of that wash and make it a little bit darker, but still sticking within the same color family so they won't muddy each other up too much. Excuse me. All right. The tiniest bit of cyan, because that cyan can overpower it really quickly and desaturate it a lot. I want it to be a lot more saturated than that. I'm gonna go back in and add more of my yellow to try and saturate it a bit more. Okay, I think that's pretty good, and I need to take from my clean water there so I'm not muddying it up even further. And then just do a nice glaze on top of it with just a slightly darker color. I noticed too, I missed right here where like I have the undershadow from this casting under there. I'm gonna go back in and try to add that real fast. Okay. So, need a lot more yellow than that. Look at that, that's a very clean, like neutral gray. Do a little swab of it right there. I actually really like that blend there. And it's also really crazy. Like the physics behind color theory can get so complicated very quickly, especially since like, I mean, just the way that wavelengths work and things like that. Because I'm mixing 3 colors here and, you know, they all have slightly different values, but none of them are as dark a value as my black. And yet together, when you combine them, you get all those wavelengths trying to fight each other. They can get dark very quickly. It's kind of just crazy how that works. Okay. Mixing more of that shadow color. So I can just get a little bit more detail in here. I'm going to go back through and add a little bit of it to my wash so it's a little more cohesive. Right, and then I have also a little bit of details here, so I'm going to start trying to block in those details just a little bit and try to get a little more of this shadow that's coming up on the edge. Just very cleanly. That's getting a lot closer to where I want it. And the wonderful thing with watercolors is that you can kind of like layer, keep adding depth, keep adding details and things like that for a very long time. But even this, like, it's starting to look like a complete piece. Like if I went on top of this with fine liner right now or microns or anything like that, a waterproof pen, I can get a finished drawing very quickly. Okay, I'm gonna dig into my black a little bit here so I can get some of these darker shadows. So I'm not boring you guys with all my constant mixing really quickly over here. And make them a really dark, saturated blue. I'll even switch my brushes here to something a little bit finer. I'm gonna go with my number 2 Creative Mark Mimic Kolinsky round brush. And just take a little bit of that and start working it right in here. So we get a little bit more depth in those windows. And I need a little bit right here. I'm going to glaze over a little bit of that red tone. Start to get a little bit more of the detail in this. These architectural drawings are always really fun to just lay down watercolor very quickly. I think I see a lot of people out there who do architectural drawings, and you know, these really clean, like geometric shapes that they make very impressionistic, right? And the contrast between like how they're painting them and the actual form is really beautiful. Okay, and I need a little more detail down here. Just start going in with that very dark desaturated color. Not desaturated, saturated color. Because whenever I'm doing super dark colors, I like to keep them very saturated, just because I feel like it adds so much depth of field to the image that it wouldn't have otherwise. And obviously this is still a much more desaturated color than any of my other colors in this image so far. But it's still going to add so much more depth with just like that little bit of pop. And it's fun too, even if I have like this blue overlay here, I could even go in, this is going to be drastically different than my painting, so bear with me. I could even go in with a really desaturated magenta, not desaturated, getting terms mixed up, a really dark value magenta, right? Mixing my black in with my magenta there. And I could use it to glaze my shadows. And the painting overall, it's still going to look like a blue surface, right? But that little bright pop of magenta in the shadows is going to make it just a little bit more colorful without being overbearing. So if I add a little bit of this in, like right here. Into these shadows, you can already see how it's getting like a lot more colorful very quickly while still keeping the general dark, shadowy area of this drawing. So don't be afraid if you're glazing over your other colors trying to get shadows, don't be afraid of going for a different color, because maybe you have a really cool surface like this, but maybe the shadows are a lot warmer. You want to bring out those warm tones by glazing a slightly different color over on top of them. And that is an excellent way to do that. Get out a little bit more up here. I'll even add a little bit to my windows up here. Remember, the more pigments I'm adding to it, the darker that color is going to look. Just the tiny hints of it right at the top there. And like, feel free to let me know in the chat too, like, what's your favorite colors to work with in your palette? Are you someone who likes to work with a lot of primaries on your palette? Do you like to mix it up? Maybe you really like a sepia or a Van Dyke brown or any colors like that? Or is there like a really fun color that you liked in? Like maybe you like a bright gold, or maybe like an interference color that kind of layers really lightly. Let me know if there's like, if you guys have a favorite watercolor palette that you like to use. Because there's so many fun ways to add to your watercolor palette. And like, primaries are only the beginning. Whenever you start with your watercolor palette, you know, whenever I'm building up a palette, I like to start with my primaries, and then like, oh, I'll find a color that I mix a lot, so I like to get a tube of that color to add in. And then I like to add some really fun colors. Like recently I have a little travel palette that I like to carry around, and I got an even smaller travel palette to go with it that has a lot of just little fun colors for me to carry around that I can use whenever I'm in the mood to add like a little sparkle of gold or something like that in there. And it's just kind of like a little fun addition to my regular primary colors that I'm using all of the time. So let me know if you guys have anything fun or things that I should try out, because I love trying out watercolors that I haven't heard of before.
Sherry on Facebook says, what's the craziest medium you've ever painted with? Like, she's heard of people painting with coffee.
Oh.
And then have you painted with that, and do you think it would work with watercolors? And also she says you're doing amazing.
Thank you so much. I'm a little nervous, if you could tell, but we'll get there. I'll keep practicing at it. I have not painted with coffee. I've seen a lot of people do it, and I do think it could work very well with watercolors. I would suggest, like, you can definitely stain your paper with coffee and then paint watercolors over top of it. I would not recommend going the other way around or doing them together, like wet washes together, because I just feel like coffee is gonna be really wet. You know, there's not a lot of pigment to coffee, and whatever you paint with coffee, like if I put a wash of pigment right next to it, it's gonna bleed into that coffee and immediately dilute any kind of color you have in it. Because coffee tends to be a really light stain. So if you're gonna like stain your piece of watercolor paper and then paint over it, I think that's great. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend like painting and then staining, because I feel like it would wash your colors out really quickly, because you could reactivate your colors, because since there's just such a high water contact in coffee. But I've never tried it, so I'm not gonna say it's impossible. The craziest thing I've ever painted with, I am not sure, honestly. Like, the craziest paint I've ever worked with is something called casein paint, which is made, I forget what, it's made with like milk proteins, and so it smells really sweet, actually. It's kind of crazy how sweet it smells. To the point where I'm like, you know, you shouldn't eat your paint products because they can have like toxic things in them and they're just not generally great to eat. But it's like, it almost smells like a little sweet snack, and your paintings will smell really sweet too. It's really fun to work with, and it works just like gouache would, right? You can water it down like gouache would, but you can also paint opaquely with it. So if anyone's painted with casein, like, definitely give your opinion on it in the chat and let me know what you think. I've only used it a few times, but it's definitely kind of a fun, wonky thing to work with that I haven't seen a lot of people use. So, just going in a little bit with more of this magenta. And this painting too, like, you can get really complex with your color schemes. This painting looks like it was painted with primaries, I will admit that. And that's like, I kind of like emphasizing that sometimes, because you can kind of be like, oh, I painted this with just primaries. And it's almost like a little impressive thing that people are like, oh, that's so cool, limited color palette. But you can mix any amount of colors with your 3 primaries, right? You can get an extremely diverse level of colors, and feel free to get an even more dark. Don't feel like you're restricted, right? Because you are working with a restricted palette, but that doesn't mean your color choices are restricted. It just takes a little bit more time to get there, and a lot more thinking of like, oh yeah, this is a blue, but it's not like a super cool icy blue, right? It has like hints of like this yellow tone in it, and has hints of that red tone, and things like that. Like, you can definitely use a color wheel to help you think about that. Like, this color wheel especially has like, you know, it has, if I have a red color and I'm adding yellow, what kind of color am I gonna get? And it talks about your tertiary colors and things like that, and like your tint tone shades, which if you don't know what those are, your tint is when you're adding in white, or in the case of watercolor, it's just when you're layering a light color right onto the paper, because since watercolor optically mixes, it's gonna optically mix with your white paper. So your tint is just layering it on the white paper. Your tone is when you're mixing your color in with a neutral gray, right? And then your shade is when you're mixing that color in with a black. So these colors down here, these are our shades, are gonna be a lot more desaturated. They're gonna be darker, but more desaturated than like up here, as opposed to if I were to mix my own black with different colors. Like, my favorite way to mix a black is to use like an ultramarine and a burnt sienna. It creates a really excellent, like super desaturated dark tone that I actually think I used on my first show here, was mixing those 2 colors together. It's an excellent way to get a black, and there are a lot of different ways to mix blacks. So if you don't have a black in your palette, like I do right here, don't be afraid. You can definitely mix one. You can create some really wonderful blacks. I mean, there's plenty of watercolor palettes out there that don't come with a black for that exact reason, is to kind of challenge you to mix your own and to think more deeply about like, is this shadow truly just black, or is there more to it than that? Like, is it a cooler black? Is it a warmer black? Does it have like a gold kind of essence to it, you know? And so don't be afraid if you don't have a black. If you don't have a white with watercolors, you really can use these 3 for anything you'd like, and you can get a lot of diversity with it. Okay, I forgot what I was doing. I'm mixing this tone, so I feel like I'm using it for something. So let's just go in. I've had a little bit of bleeding here, which is just fine, because I'm going to go over top of it and clean it up a little bit, because it's all dry now. So I can get a much cleaner wash if I go right on top of it. And I'm going to be a little more careful this time, add a little more detail, because like every wash I do, I'm adding in slightly more detail. You know, if you're working with watercolors, if you have a lot of highlights, you don't want to add a gouache in. Definitely think about what details you want to pop out beforehand. But when it comes to shadows and things like that, you can continually layer more and more detail with your darker tones, like I'm doing right here. So I'm going to emphasize the shadow a little bit more. I'm going to add a little bit more like hints of detail. Like I have these little, I'm not sure what these are. They look like little plaques on the wall here, and they're very hard to see. But I'm just gonna emphasize them just a little bit with like a little bitty like circle on my painting right here, and I'll hold this up for you so you guys can see the different colors I'm using a little bit better. You can see the magenta popping out underneath these shadows and how it kind of creates a warmer tone coming down off this different surface. And if you want to emphasize, like if you have two different surfaces that are very similar in their hue, a great way to emphasize the difference is with temperature, right? So maybe one surface, even though it's the same hue, is a slightly warmer temperature than the other surface. Those little bitty distinctions between the two can create like a lot of depth and dimension in an image that wouldn't have been there otherwise. So if you're getting like a little hung up on like, well, these two surfaces look different than me in the image, but like they look like they're the same color too. Maybe all you need to do is add like a little bit of red to one or a little bit of blue to the other, and it could make a world of difference. Okay. Let's see here. I have these little ridges right here that I want to emphasize a little bit more, and they have these little balls kind of popping off of them, so I'm just gonna hint at those just a little bit. And these like perspectives on these rounded architectural drawings get really tricky sometimes, so make sure you have a good sketch before you start out, because sometimes I just like to start painting and skip over like getting all the details on the sketching part, and then I look at it afterwards and I'm like, oh, this is so wonky. Why did I just jump in? Because I was so eager to paint rather than sketching out my reference and everything. Okay. I even have a little bit more of like a lip up here, so maybe I'll just do a little quick swipe there to show that. And if you guys have any requests for like colors that you want me to show you how to mix, like feel free to add that in the chat and I'll try to mix them with my primaries here real quick. So add a little bit of detail. It's like these crazy cool circular, almost fence details. I'm not sure if you guys can even see them right here. Well, I'm going to switch back to my larger brush real quick. Or I'll switch to my other flat brush I have, which is a number 6, just so I can get more of those lines drawn down. I'm going to add a little bit of water because my paint's drying out a little bit here. Just be able to get a little bit of those shadows back. Because it's really just adding shadows on top of shadows on top of shadows, and maybe I'll even come in here and like hint at all this texture that's on this roof from all the rain and everything that's beaten down on it. Adding a little bit more of that in. Alright. Whoops. I got a little bit wonky there at the side. Don't be afraid to. I'm keeping this kind of straight so you guys can see better what I'm doing. But if you're working with watercolors, it's the same thing as if you're like drafting something out. Feel free to like switch it around so you can get a better stroke when you're painting it. Unlike me, because I just went like whoop whoop and it came out really squiggly because I was pulling that line towards myself rather than trying to push it away. As is like, it's a little bit better if you're trying to like push your lines away from you, you're more likely to get a straight clean line than pulling it towards yourself.
Tracy said yellow ochre.
Yellow ochre. You want me to mix yellow ochre? Okay. So yellow ochre is kind of like a brownish yellow, right? So we're gonna do, I'm gonna actually mix it on my other side here. I had these toothpicks resting here. I'm gonna mix it over here. Start by just throwing some water in, and we're gonna definitely start with a lot of yellow because it's a dark brownish yellow. So I'm thinking of it like this, like in terms of ratios of primary, it's gonna be mostly yellow. Next step down is probably gonna be magenta, and then after that is gonna be our cyan, right? In terms of like ratios. So I'm gonna add some of my magenta because yellow ochre is a very warm, like yellowish. Yellow ochre is obviously a very warm brownish tone. So I'm gonna add that in. And like the littlest bit of cyan. These paints are really wet right now, so I'm getting a ton of pigment off of them like the moment I take my brush out. You see, that's way too green. That's way too green. So I gotta go back and add more yellow and more magenta to it. Because I don't want my magenta to overpower my yellow, but I still need it to be a lot warmer than that. Oop, and that's way... You guys can't see it, but I'm picking up like whole little scoops of pigment here just because my paints have been wet. And I gotta make sure I'm not adding too much since I'm mixing such a small amount here. It's just the tiniest bit of magenta. Okay. That's decently close. That's pretty close. I wish I had a yellow ochre to compare it to. I don't, but we're kind of getting there. Here, I'll swatch it down on the paper so you guys don't have to deal with the glare. And so we can see it a bit better, because, your swatch is going to look different from, like, your mixed color in the pan. And that's getting a little bit closer. I think yellow ochre tends to be a little bit darker than that. So maybe I'll go in and add just, like, the slightest bit more blue and magenta to try and, like, darken it, but also desaturate it just the slightest amount. And that's probably closer to what a traditional yellow ochre might look like in terms of watercolors. So thank you. Hopefully that's satisfactory.
Ralph on YouTube wants to know what you would do if you wanted to give the impression of gold.
Give the impression of gold.
With your primaries. I know you can't because it's metallic, but like if you wanted the tone.
So it really depends on what you're trying to reference. Whenever you're doing a metallic, I recommend looking at references, because while we have like general colors for what gold, anything that's gold is highly reflective, right? So light's gonna be bouncing off of it. It's gonna drastically change depending on what kind of lighting it is. Like I have the top of these spires here in my image are gold. They're gold in my image. I made them a very warm kind of yellow tone, right? It's almost an orange, but not quite, to try and imitate the light bouncing off of it. But even like this yellow ochre right here that I just mixed could be a great gold tone in some cases. Let's see if I can mix something that would be an interesting gold tone. So definitely a yellow heavy color, right? But also a very warm color in most cases, though it can be a lot cooler depending on the lighting. And it also depends too, like the thing with any kind of painting is that color is very relative, right? So I can have a painting that's like majority red. It could look like a very red painting, but you like, say you're in a room with someone and the lighting is red, right? Everything's gonna look red, but you'll still kind of be able to tell the differences between different colors, right? You might be able to tell if something's blue. You might be able to tell if something's green depending on how the light's affecting it. Our brain can process those kind of changes very quickly. So, like, a gold color in a different kind of lighting can look drastically different than a gold color, like, in a blue lighting as opposed to a red lighting. But it can still look that way, even though it might be, like, a bright pink if you take it out in comparison to all the other colors that surround it. And that's definitely something to think about when you're doing your reference images. Like, if you want to take a digital color picker and pick out those colors from your reference images and look at them prior to painting, that might be a really great thing to do, especially if you have something with, like, really complex color tones, like someone standing in a red room. Because you might think something looks blue, and then you pick it up and it's actually, like, a really dark red or something like that. And that's kind of the crazy way that our brain processes color, and that's way too much cyan to make a gold, so I don't know why I picked up that much. But I'm gonna continue adding in more yellow. And see, even that there, it's a very vibrant orange, and it's not like, it doesn't mimic the metallic colors of gold, but in some cases, like, that might be your gold color in comparison to all the other colors on your palette. So particularly when it comes to like metallic colors like gold, if you want to mimic them without getting the actual color, like, think about very closely what you're painting and how it's going to look in comparison to the other colors in your painting. Right, so there's a little bit of like more blue, dark blue tones down here where this railing is. So I'm going to try to hint at that a little bit more because I have that magenta laid down. So I can lay a more cyan tone on top of it and create a really rich kind of shadow. Also, let me know if I say kind of a lot. Because I'm realizing now that I'm saying that a lot, and I was mixing a magenta too. This is a rate ma on how well they can paint and talk at the same time. Because you think like it looks easy, especially when Emmy does it. She makes it look very easy, but the instant you try doing it, it's like, what am I doing? I'm not even thinking about what I'm doing. I'm just picking things up and putting them down. I love you, Emmy. I know you're watching somewhere. Okay. A little bit. I think that'll do. To add just a little more hint of like a cyan right in here. Maybe I'll just go across the whole thing with that. Because while I have, like I could pick out the details right here and paint these little hints of fence. Like I could go through like what I did with the magenta and just dot at it. But sometimes with these architectural drawings, if you want to keep them more impressionistic, you have areas like that. You might just paint the whole area with a cyan like I did. And it can hint at them without getting too bogged down in the details if you're looking for a more impressionistic thing. If you're doing true realism, you want to be able to make sure like you cut them out when you're painting. And this is a very cool blue that I'm using right now because I mixed it with a bit of magenta, so that made it almost darker towards like the violet end of the spectrum. Because as much as we like to think like magenta can be considered a warm color, again, like warm and cold are also very relative compared to other colors. A lot of people, when looking at the color wheel, will consider magenta to be a cool tone, and then the warm version of that would be a red, right? So mix a magenta with a little bit of yellow, and you'll get a very warm tone, as opposed to your magenta, which is very cool, which is why it can make your cyan even cooler. Alright, so I'm adding a little bit of here, and I wanted more of a true cyan coming in here, where like the light is hitting things more directly. I have just a little bit right there where I can do a wash of a very light cyan that I think would work well. And I'm running out of space to mix here without mudding up my colors, so I'm going to take my rag really quick, and I'm going to wipe it up. Then we're going to be wrapping up here very soon. So if you have any more questions, make sure you get them in now. But I'm just going to add these little details here, and then I think we'll probably be wrapping it up.
One last color challenge.
Yeah?
Turquoise.
Turquoise. Okay. So turquoise is a very greenish blue tone. So I'm, of course, going to start out with like a strong cyan. And then I'll probably just add in like the tiniest bit of yellow. Turquoise, I admit, I've tried to mix turquoise a lot of times, and it's kind of a difficult color to mix. Though I know obviously here we love the teal turquoise color combination. But yeah, I'm going to start out with my really strong cyan, and then I'm going to go in. And yellow as a value has a very light value, so I'm going to make sure I mix in a decent amount. You know, we're getting a very greenish tone right here, which is not turquoise, you know. We need to be a lot bluer than that, so I'm going to go back in. And I think that's getting kind of close. Let me know too how accurate you think my actual color challenges here were, or if you think they're wildly off to what you think the color would be. I gotta know if I need to improve. Of course I always need to improve, but... Alright, I think that's getting pretty close. In comparison with like the very cool blue tones I have on my paper, it maybe looks super green. But I think that's like a decent turquoise, or maybe it's more of like a phthalo viridian color than a true turquoise. Maybe it needs to be a little bit bluer, so I'm going to add the tiniest bit of blue in. That looks pretty similar, but I think that's pretty good. Let me know how you think about it. All right. So I think I'm going to call it here in terms of our painting. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Again, if you want to be able to find the teacher's cart, you have to type our teacher's code, JL283, into the search bar on JerrysArtarama.com, and able to find any of these supplies. But primaries, again, great for any kind of media you're working in, particularly watercolors. If you want to join our Jerry's Live Facebook page, it's a great place to go if you want to see other people posting their art. If you want to post whatever you create after these show, we would love to see it. Post it there. In order to join, you have to answer the security code. Otherwise, we will deem you a robot, and we're not going to let you in. So make sure you answer that security code if you want to be able to post your art and show it. Now, next week's show, going back to an Emmy show, she is going to be talking about the Artfinity inks, the new Artfinity inks. It's a very exciting show. I'm going to make sure she shows you guys the poison color that we talked about a lot on our last show. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week. Thanks so much for coming for my first solo show. It means a lot. And yeah, bye.